Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share with you a couple of cards that I made with this beautiful Friendship Blooms sets from Pink Fresh Studio. For this video, I'm only using the stamp set and the die. In a future one, I will use those beautiful layering stencils. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm positioning my flower stamps on some watercolor paper. For the techniques for the cards in this video, we're going to use some Lindy's magical powders. I love them because they've got some beautiful pigment to them and they also have a nice shimmer to them. I couldn't decide if I wanted to do white embossed outline or black embossed outline. So I'm doing 2 with white embossed outline and 2 with black embossed outline. And by 2, I mean pieces of watercolor paper. I want to make sure that I have lots of flowers to choose from at the end when I'm creating the cards. So I stamped my images with Versamark ink, which is a nice sticky ink for that embossing powder to stick to. It's a clear ink, so you can't really see it often when on camera, but you can see it in real life. I did stamp it twice because we're using watercolor paper, and because watercolor paper has some texture to it, I wanted to make sure that I had a really good stamped image. Once I've got the powder sticking to the embossing powder, once I have the powder sticking to the Versamark ink, I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder for the image for my flowers. If you're new to embossing, an embossing tool is a tool that emits heat and it melts that powder right where it is. You don't want to use a blow dryer. A blow dryer will blow air and it will dry out the ink underneath and will basically just blow the powder off. You need something that emits heat that just melts the powder exactly where it is sticking to the ink. So like I said, I did 2 with white outlines, 2 with black outlines, and I'm also doing 2 sheets of each with the leaves and the sentiments that come with this stamp set. It was at this point that I realized there was actually a flaw in my stamp set, and there's going to be a line going through that medium-sized flower there. You can see it right there. I'm pointing to it. And it also goes through a couple of the verses. Pink Fresh is sending me a new set to replace it, but I didn't want to wait until that set arrived to complete these cards. Often when I get an idea in my head or a plan in my head, I just have to complete it to get it out of my head. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to hide the lines and the flowers when I'm positioning my pieces on my final card. I've got this beautiful magical powder set. I'm just using the crimson and the green from this set. There are other colors to choose from, and they have lots of different sets to choose from as well. What I like to do when I'm using watercolor paper and I'm using a technique with lots of fluid is I like to spray the back of my watercolor paper as well as my surface and push my paper down into it. It tends to make it not warp as bad because when I go to put that water on the front, there's already water on the back. So my paper will stay flatter, and having the water on the back of my paper as well as the surface kind of suctions it in place. And I found it's a great trick for controlling your paper warping. Now, because you've got water on both sides of the paper, it does take a little bit longer to dry, but I think it's definitely worth it to not have to fight with paper that is warping while you're working on it. I've sprayed lots of water on my surface here, and then I'm using a fan brush to tap some of the powders onto that water surface. They're going to bloom and spread out as it sits in the water. And once I have as much powder as I want on that surface, I'm also going to spray it a second time just to enhance that a little bit more, because you'll see it does bloom and bleed out, but it does stop at some point. So by adding more water, it's going to continue that spreading process. And it's really, the name of these magicals is perfect because it's magical when you watch them bloom and spread around. It's one of my favorite things to do. I love watching how they work. I also love that they have different colored pigments in each of the powders. So you've got, for the greens, you've got some light greens and dark greens, and it creates some natural depth to it. So when I'm sprinkling my powder onto the surface, I'm trying to sprinkle it where I want the darkest color, and I let it spread out from there. I tend to try not to play with it as much as possible because I just really like the look of it. But if you do get a clump of powder that you're really not happy with, you can take a brush and work that out. For this particular project, I didn't do that. I just kept using the spray and sprinkling excess powder on. What I did do though is if I noticed some of the water was pooling in an area that I didn't want it to, I just took a corner of a paper towel and I sopped some of that up. Once that water is absorbed into the paper, you can move it onto some paper towel, and that will help speed up the drying a little bit. But I don't do that until that water is absorbed into the paper, because if there's a pool of water there and I move it, I'm going to be moving that pool. If you're okay with it, you can absolutely do that, but I was trying to kind of keep the powders where they naturally went because I really liked the look of them. You can also use a heated tool to blow on there to help speed up the drying. I do this after I've already had the water seep into the edges or into the paper and put it on the paper towel. A heated tool is just less intense than an embossing tool. You could use an embossing tool, but it's quite, the heat is quite directed, and it's a lot more of an intense heat, and it tends to curl the paper a little bit more. The heated tool is just a little bit more gentle. So for drying things, I prefer to use that. Once I have all of my pieces colored and dried, I'm going to use my die cuts, the coordinating die cuts, and I'm going to die cut those pieces out. So for this particular technique, the tapping the mica powders or the magicals onto the background, I'm only using my white outline. I'm going to use them in a different way for the black outline. So I've got all of my pieces here cut and ready to go. I'm going to put them to the side. So my second technique with the black outlines, I'm taking the mica powders and I'm putting them on the little mat on the side of my glass mat here, and I'm going to watercolor them on. Now I can control where the dark goes with this, and I'll start putting the darkest color on first, and then I will wipe the excess off my brush and spread it out. It is another beautiful way of using these powders. The only thing for this is you don't have the color gradation the same way as the first. So if you do have these magical powders, I encourage you to try them both ways and see what is your preference. My preference is the first way. I just like the way it looks. It looks a little bit less controlled, a little bit more, well, less controlled is basically the only term that I can think of right now. But if you like to have control and like to control where each color goes, then this particular technique might be better for you. I'm using a watercolor brush that has water right in the handle. So when I am putting the brush right on that paper towel that you see on the lower left side of the, or lower right side of the screen there, it's just tapping or getting some of the excess of the color off and cleaning my brush for my next color, or just letting me control how much color I'm putting onto the paper. You can see I'm not being very careful with my watercoloring, and that's because I'm going to be die cutting this out anyways. So I don't need to be pristine with my watercolor. I don't mind if I have a little bit of that color outside of the stamped edge. When I die cut, I am going to see a little bit of that edge out there. So if that bothers you, then you can be a little bit more precise with your watercolor. But for the look I was going with, I didn't need to be. With the flowers, because there are so many petals for them, I tend to go in and do kind of a wash over the whole thing, starting where I want the color to be the darkest and then blending out. And then I'll go back in and I'll tap some of the darker colors again where I want those colors to be darkest. And for what I'm doing here, I'm trying to make the petals darkest towards the center of the flower and have them a little bit lighter towards the outside of the flower. Now you can take a look at flowers, and there are so many different color variations. Some of them are lighter towards the center and darker towards the outside. Some are the opposite. Some have, say, pink in the center and then a little bit of yellow on the outside. So really the sky's the limit when it comes to color combinations for this. So have fun, play with them. But I really love how full and how beautiful these flowers are. I'm going to speed it up here because when I go to the second one, the process is exactly the same as the first one. While these colors are still wet, you can continue to tweak and play around with them. Once they're dry though, if you go in and play around with them, you kind of have to do an entire petal because you will get some watermarks if you only color in a certain area of a petal. That's just the way watercolors tend to work. Now I'm doing this technique with watercolor paper and embossing. You could do this with mixed media paper as well, and technically you don't necessarily need to emboss these flowers. You could just stamp them. However, by embossing them, I get a little bit of a ridge, and they tend to be a little bit more forgiving when I'm watercoloring. I don't have the colors seeping into other petals that I don't want them to, because the ridges of the embossing tends to act like a little bit of a dam and keep those colors where I want them to. If you were to do it with just stamping and not embossing, you would need to do individual petals at a time and let them dry before working on the ones beside it, just so that you have a little bit more control here. I decided I had a lot of that Magicals powders on my mat, so I wanted to create a bit of a background here. Originally, I thought I was going to be using this in the card, but in the end, I didn't. But I wanted to keep this in the video just to show you one thing that you can do with those extra Magicals if you happen to have some extras on your mat, rather than waste them. So I took another piece of watercolor paper. You could do this with mixed media paper as well. You just want to use paper that can handle some moisture. I tapped it into those colors, and I'm using my heated tool to dry it. It doesn't need to be 100% dry, like 80–90% is fine, but any wet areas, when you tap it back in there, it's just going to join with those wet pools that are on my mat. What I'm trying to do is get an all over color with some really nice texture. And this is a common background that I do with distress inks. They're water reactive ink pads that one of the fun techniques you can do is this type of background, but it works with these Magicals as well. Tiny little bit different, but again, it's very similar. And the nice thing with doing this is if I was to use it in the card that I ended up making, it would be an exact match to the colors in the card. I wouldn't have to go and match some solid color red cardstock if I wanted that in there. Like I said, in the end, I didn't use it with these cards. I found there was too much red with all the flowers, and that anyways, they took over a large part of the card, so I ended up coordinating it with green. But I could have taken my excess green inks and created a background like this to be using in this card. I just didn't think about it at the time, as well as the fact that I didn't have as much of the green left over as I do of the red. But once again, you keep on tapping it into that pot of ink, or those spots of ink on that mat, and then using the heated tool to dry it. You can do this as many or as few times as you want. Really could have stopped at the beginning when the whole page was completely covered, but I wanted to see if I could get the same or a similar texture that you get with distress inks. So I tucked that to the side. Now that I've got all of my pieces cut out and ready to go here, I'm going to start with my card making. I have a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card here that I'm creating. So my cardstock was 8.5 by 5.5 before I scored it and folded it in half. I've got some really, really pretty Spellbinders. I think they're called Border Abilities. They're edge dies that I really like to use when creating cards on some of the edges. I haven't used them in a long time, so I figured I'd pull them out. They create a really unique and fun edge, and because there's several different choices in the sets, you can choose which ones you want to put together. There's a couple different edges to use, and then there's a couple different kind of lacy ones where it cuts out pieces here. You do want to take your die tape and tape them in place. I'm using the lines on my mat here to line up with the bottom of the card and then line up with the edges of the dies to make sure that I have them evenly on my card. You need to open up your card to do the cutting, because if you have it closed, you're going to be cutting through the back as well. And I do put it back and forth several times just to get all of those pieces cut out. If you have a machine that's not quite as tight, you can go and put a piece of cardstock underneath the bottom plate just to tighten it up a little bit and get all of those pieces cut out. Take the die tape and the dies off of your card base, and then any pieces that remain, you can use a die pick and poke those out. One of the things that I really like to use when taking all those little bits and pieces out of the die that you see on the left is a Spellbinders 2-in-1. It takes those out really, really easily. After doing the die cutting, you may notice that the card doesn't fold quite as nicely as it did originally. So by running the side of your bone folder on there, you'll just help put that crease back in there and have it lie a little bit flatter. Before I glue anything down, I like to lay things out just to see if I can create an arrangement that I like. It just saves time rather than having to move and pick things off if I didn't like it to start with. I'm gluing things down with my Distress Collage medium. I like using this because, especially for this, it's a liquid glue that has a little bit of drying time to it. So if I want to move things or if I want to tuck something underneath there, I have the ability to do that. It's not going to be dried in place immediately. So it gives me a little bit of playtime and a little bit of room to do that. especially for flowers, because often it's not until you have your flowers in place that you could see exactly where the leaves should go. So it's nice to be able to move and lift things around while you're still working to tuck those leaves in there. These flowers would look awfully boring without any leaves, and it also helps to break up the red color to it. So that leaf that I just put on the left there, that's covering the line in that defect for that stamped image, but you'll never know that it was there. Once I have all of the dies or all of my die cuts in place, I'm going to put an acrylic block on there to dry just to hold everything in place and hold it down. And there I'm using my Spellbinders 2-in-1 to remove all of those little white bits there. There's a couple tiny small ones that I can use a die pick to take them out. And typically I'll do this right over a garbage can so that I don't have to clean up after myself. Off screen, I took some greens and I matted a dark one with a lighter one on top to use on the center of the card. And you can see how it really makes that edge of that card stand out. One thing I forgot to mention when I was placing my die is my intention for these cards is to have them standing up vertically. So because I intend for them to stand that way, I don't have my dies right to the edge. If you wanted your cards to stand up horizontally, you should place the outermost part of this die against the edge of the cardstock so that you don't have a shorter front than back. If you have a shorter front than back, it's not going to stand quite right. You can get it to stand, but it's not going to stand quite right. And then you may want to also alter the design on the inside because you're not going to see it if it's standing up. But for the second one here, I chose a little bit different die of the Spellbinders border abilities. It's similar to the first one in that it has several different outline choices or edge choices, as well as several different inside choices to choose from. I taped it in place. I cut it out exactly the same way as the first one. And then I start to put my die cuts down. I'm putting them down in a very similar pattern to the first card. My leaves might be in a little bit different places just because of the way the flowers were looking. They may be different. It doesn't really matter. You're not going to send both cards to the same person anyway, so they're never ever going to know. So same as the first one, I'm using my Distress Collage medium to put everything in place and play around with it. Now, the one thing about Distress Collage medium, if I happen to get some glue where it's going to be visible on the card, it dries completely clear and it dries matte. So as long as that glue hasn't hit any ink to transfer it, you're never going to see that there was glue there. But again, it's handy to have so that I can move and shimmy things in place. I can tilt a flower a little bit more if I wanted to. It just gives you a little bit more playtime and a little bit more forgiveness when you're creating your cards. In the end, I didn't use any sentiments on this card. I had planned to use one of the ones that I embossed, but it just didn't look quite right on the inside of the card. I did cut it out and put it in, but it just didn't look right. Probably would have been okay if I had stamped and embossed directly on the inside inserts that I've made, the green ones. But because there's a flaw in the stamp, the one that I really wanted to use had a flaw in it, and I didn't want to go about trying to fix it and possibly ruining things. So there I have the front of the card done. For this particular one, I had a green insert, and then I outlined it I matted it with black, just to tie in with the black embossing on the stamped image. So I'm going to put it inside the card the same way. I glued it together off camera, and I'm just positioning it in the center here. So here's where I'm showing you the finished cards here. At this point, I was not sure if I wanted to add anything more to there. So this is how they're intended to stand. Again, you can see on the top view here that if I put them down horizontally, they kind of lean a little bit off. In the end, I decided to add a little bit of stickles to the outside of the flowers. I didn't want to put it all over the flowers because that would have been too much, as well as the fact that it would rehydrate the ink underneath and possibly change the colors a little bit. So I just did kind of a little bit around the outside of some of the petals. I didn't do all of the petals. I just wanted to add a touch of sparkle, but not have it overwhelming. I did put some of that sparkle on the center part of the white embossed large flower. I did it on the black one as well, but I ended up wiping it off with a Q-tip because I didn't like it on top of the black one. the black embossing, the center of the flower, it has a little bit more detail to it that is visible. So it looks all right as it is, but the white one, it kind of gets a little bit lost. So by putting some of that stickles on that there, just adds a little bit of a center focal point onto that flower. So you can add as much or as little stickles as you want. I tend to be of the opinion that less is more. I like it to add just a little bit of sparkle and to enhance it, but I don't want to overwhelm everything. And really, when it comes to stickles, the more you add, the longer the drying time. And if you're not familiar with stickles, it's just glitter glue that has a really fine tip to it, so you can get a nice fine line to it. And because it's glitter and glue all mixed up, you don't need to play around with loose glitter and a glue pen or glue or whatever. It's just very convenient, and it's a nice, easy way just to add a little bit of sparkle and embellishment to your cards. So it is a really nice thing to have in your arsenal to be adding to cards. And for those of you that hate loose glitter, this is a great way to add a little bit of sparkle and add a little bit of glitter without having to play with loose glitter and having it all over the place. So there's the final result. I think those stickles really did a beautiful job of just adding just a touch of sparkle to those cards. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and watching the process of using these Magicals powders. And if you haven't played with them, they are so much fun to play with. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a fabulous day.